Rebecca's water broke at 3:42 p.m. in the hospital cafeteria, 8 weeks early. But when the staff rushed to help her, Dr. James Mitchell walked past without stopping, his arm wrapped around Elena, the mistress he'd been parading through the hallways for weeks, completely unaware the pregnant wife he divorced that morning was a secret trillionaire who'd purchased his family hospital, the building his grandfather had founded, specifically to control his destiny. He abandoned her at the hospital, literally stepping over her wheelchair to get into the elevator with Elena, while his mother Patricia watched from the second-floor window, her phone camera recording Rebecca's distress to send to their family group chat with the caption, "The trash taking itself out," mocking her tears even as contractions racked her body. The emergency room staff knew something the Mitchell family didn't. Rebecca's medical records listed her emergency contact as Montgomery Holdings' legal team, and her insurance wasn't regular coverage but executive platinum tier that only billionaire families possessed. Yet she'd never corrected anyone's assumptions about her financial status. Elena whispered in James's ear about their honeymoon plans to Bali, using money from the joint account he'd drained, believing Rebecca couldn't fight back legally. But in the hospital's administrative office, Rebecca's lawyers were already filing charges for theft, fraud, and financial abuse. Patricia had spent 3 years destroying Rebecca's confidence with carefully crafted insults about her clothing, her background, her worthiness to be a Mitchell. Never suspecting that Rebecca's cheap clothes were by choice, her humble demeanor was protective camouflage, and her silence during abuse was evidence collection. The hospital's staff had been informed that morning about their new owner, and they'd watched in horror as James Mitchell abused his soon-to-be ex-wife publicly, giving them the evidence Rebecca needed to justify his termination for unprofessional conduct and creating a hostile work environment, charges that would destroy his medical career permanently. How would James survive when his career, reputation, and freedom were simultaneously destroyed? What would Patricia do when she realized she'd bullied a billionaire who now controlled everything she valued? Would Elena stay when James became the penniless, disgraced man he'd accused Rebecca of being? And what final devastating truth would Rebecca reveal that would leave him broken and begging for another chance? This story teaches powerful lessons about the danger of public cruelty and karmic justice, how abusers often project their worst qualities onto victims, the wisdom of silence when you're building your case, and that real power moves in silence while fake power needs an audience. Viewers will learn to never show all your cards too early, that people who mock others' pain reveal their own moral bankruptcy, the importance of having your own resources in any relationship, and how systematic dismantling is more effective than explosive confrontation. You'll benefit from recognizing toxic relationship patterns, understanding strategic patience, seeing the complete consequences of betrayal and family abuse, and experiencing the profound satisfaction of watching justice unfold perfectly. 3 hours before Rebecca's water broke, she sat in the hospital parking garage inside her modest Honda Civic, watching through the rearview mirror as James kissed Elena against his Mercedes, the car Rebecca had purchased for his birthday last year with money from the investment portfolio he didn't know existed. The divorce papers he'd served her that morning lay on her passenger seat, but she hadn't cried over them because she'd known they were coming for 6 months, ever since her private investigator delivered the first photographs of James and Elena leaving the Riverside Hotel. She'd cried then in her downtown penthouse that James had never visited because he believed she lived in the small apartment she maintained as a cover, but those tears had transformed into something harder, sharper, more purposeful. Rebecca had been Rebecca Montgomery before she became Rebecca Mitchell 3 years ago, but James had never asked about her family beyond the vague stories she told him about being orphaned young and raised by distant relatives. He'd never questioned why she didn't work, but also never asked for money, why she dressed modestly but her clothes never wore out, why she seemed comfortable in expensive restaurants, but claimed she'd saved up for special occasions. He'd been too absorbed in his own world, his own career, his own reflection to notice the inconsistencies, and Patricia had been too busy tearing her down to wonder why Rebecca never actually broke. The Montgomery family had built their fortune in pharmaceuticals over 4 generations, but Rebecca's grandfather had taught her that visible wealth made you a target, while invisible wealth made you powerful. She'd inherited $2.1 billion at 21 when her parents died in a plane crash, but she'd turned it into $4.7 billion through strategic investments in medical technology, real estate, and emerging markets. She'd met James at a hospital charity event where she'd been anonymously donating, drawn to his passion for cardiac surgery and his stated dedication to helping underserved communities. But she'd learned too late that his passion was really for status, and his dedication was really to his mother's approval. Patricia Mitchell had hated Rebecca from their first meeting, but not because Rebecca wasn't good enough, because Patricia sensed something she couldn't control. The older woman had spent 3 years launching strategic attacks designed to make Rebecca feel small, criticizing her clothing at family dinners, mentioning James's old girlfriends who'd come from good families, suggesting Rebecca was only interested in James for his doctor's salary, implying she was trapping him with pregnancy. Each insult had been carefully documented by Rebecca in a leather journal she kept locked in her real apartment's safe because she'd learned from her grandfather that abusers always escalated and evidence always mattered. James had changed gradually after their wedding, or perhaps he'd simply revealed who he'd always been. The man who'd promised to build a life together became the man who worked 16-hour days by choice rather than necessity, who forgot anniversaries but remembered Elena's coffee order, who criticized Rebecca's cooking but praised the hospital cafeteria's sandwiches. She'd tried at first to be the perfect wife, thinking love could be earned through devotion, but she'd realized by their second anniversary that James didn't want a partner. He wanted an audience, and she wasn't applauding enthusiastically enough. Elena had entered the picture 14 months ago as James's new surgical nurse, but Rebecca had known about the affair within 3 weeks because she'd hired the investigator the moment James started password protecting his phone. Elena was 28, ambitious, and apparently willing to believe James's lies about his loveless marriage to a woman who refused to support his career. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. Rebecca had literally purchased St. Anthony's Memorial Hospital 2 months ago, specifically because it was struggling financially, and James worked there, giving her complete control over his professional future while he plotted his personal betrayal. Now, watching him kiss Elena in the parking garage, Rebecca felt her daughter kick hard against her ribs, as if even the baby sensed the moment's significance. She placed her hand on her belly, whispering, "I know, sweetheart. We're going to be fine. Better than fine." The manila envelope on her dashboard contained the ownership transfer documents, the termination notices, the fraud evidence, and something else. Something she'd discovered just last week that would destroy James more completely than losing his job or his reputation. She'd show him that envelope soon, but first she needed to attend her scheduled ultrasound appointment, the one James had forgotten about despite her reminder text that morning. Rebecca stepped out of her Honda, smoothed her clearance rack maternity dress that had actually cost $40 but looked it, and walked toward the hospital entrance. She didn't look back at James and Elena because they no longer mattered to her present, only to the reckoning she'd carefully constructed for their future. The cafeteria had seemed like a safe place to wait before her appointment, but Rebecca's body had other plans. The first contraction hit her like a truck at 3:38 p.m. while she was paying for a bottle of water she didn't really want. And by 3:42 p.m., she felt the unmistakable warm rush that meant her water had broken. 8 weeks too early, in the middle of a crowded hospital cafeteria where at least 40 people could witness what happened next. "Someone call labor and delivery," shouted Maria, the cafeteria cashier who'd always been kind to Rebecca during her lunch visits. 2 nurses from the orthopedic wing rushed over, and within 90 seconds, Rebecca was in a wheelchair, being pushed toward the elevators while her contractions intensified with frightening speed. The pain was crushing, but what crushed her more was the sight of James stepping out of the staff elevator at precisely that moment. Elena's lipstick smeared on his collar, his hand possessively gripping her waist. Rebecca's eyes met his across the 15 feet of polished hospital floor, and for one moment, one single suspended moment, she saw recognition flicker across his face. He saw her in the wheelchair, saw her obvious distress, saw the nurse's urgent expressions. But then Elena whispered something in his ear and laughed, and James's face hardened into the expression Rebecca had come to know well over the past year. The look that said she was an inconvenience, an embarrassment, something to be stepped over rather than stepped toward. And that's exactly what he did. James Mitchell, board-certified cardiologist, man who'd taken an oath to do no harm, literally adjusted his path to step around Rebecca's wheelchair, his foot actually lifting over the wheel as he guided Elena toward the exit. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her, didn't even pause, but his mother, Patricia, appeared at the second-floor balcony overlooking the cafeteria at that exact moment, and Rebecca heard her delighted laughter echo through the atrium. Patricia had her phone out, recording, and Rebecca could see her mouth moving as she narrated for whatever audience she was performing for. The phone's camera was pointed directly at Rebecca's face, capturing her tears, her pain, her humiliation, and Patricia's expression was one of pure triumph. The look of a woman who believed she'd finally broken someone she'd never managed to break before. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need to get you upstairs immediately," the nurse pushing her wheelchair said urgently. "Your baby is coming too early. We need to try to stop the labor." But Rebecca couldn't move yet because she was watching James's back as he disappeared through the hospital doors with Elena, watching Patricia film her suffering like it was entertainment, and feeling something inside her crystallize into absolute clarity. She'd been patient, strategic, careful to document everything while protecting herself emotionally, but she'd still harbored some small hope that James might redeem himself, that when faced with his child's premature birth, he might remember he was supposed to be a father, a husband, a human being with basic decency. That hope died watching him step over her wheelchair. "Take me up," Rebecca said quietly, her voice steadier than it had any right to be. "But first, someone contact Dr. Raymond Chen in administration. Tell him Rebecca Montgomery needs him immediately. Use my full name." The nurses exchanged confused glances. They knew her as Rebecca Mitchell, but the head nurse, an older woman named Dorothy who'd worked at St. Anthony's for 30 years, went very still. "Montgomery? As in Montgomery Holdings?" "Yes," Rebecca said through another contraction. "I'm the new owner. Dr. Chen knows. And Dorothy, I need you to document exactly what just happened. Who was present, what Dr. Mitchell did, what his mother filmed, everything. Can you do that?" Dorothy's face transformed from confusion to understanding to righteous anger in 3 seconds flat. "Oh, honey, yes, I absolutely can. And I'll make sure every single person who witnessed this fills out an incident report." She turned to the other nurses. "Get her to L&D now. Page Dr. Sarah Kim. She's the best we have for premature labor. And someone find Dr. Chen. Tell him the owner is here and she's going into early labor because her husband just committed patient abandonment." As they wheeled Rebecca toward the elevator, she saw Patricia still filming from the balcony, but now Patricia was also texting. Probably to James. Probably something cruel about Rebecca, causing a scene, or being dramatic. Rebecca almost pitied her. Almost, because Patricia had no idea she just filmed evidence that would appear in multiple lawsuits, professional ethics hearings, and possibly criminal proceedings. The elevator doors closed, and Rebecca allowed herself one more moment of tears before she wiped her face and pulled out her phone. She had 3 missed calls from her legal team and 1 text from her head attorney, David Rodriguez. "Documents are ready, just say when." Rebecca typed back with shaking hands. "Now, deploy everything now." Then another contraction hit, and she focused on breathing, on staying calm for her daughter, on remembering that justice was already in motion, and revenge was simply the natural consequence of other people's choices. James had stepped over her wheelchair, but in doing so, he'd stepped over the line that would cost him everything he'd never appreciated and everything he'd always taken for granted. The labor and delivery floor was a flurry of activity when they arrived, but through the chaos, Rebecca heard her phone buzz with David's response. "Termination notice delivered to Dr. Mitchell's office. Fraud charges filed with the DA. Custody papers filed with family court. Asset freeze initiated on all joint accounts. Press release about new hospital ownership going out in 30 minutes. "It's done, Rebecca. Now focus on keeping that baby safe." Rebecca handed her phone to Dorothy. "If Patricia Mitchell or Elena Vasquez try to come up here, call security. Neither of them is on my approved visitor list. The only person I want to see is my daughter when she decides to arrive." Dorothy squeezed her hand. "You've got this, honey. And for what it's worth, I've worked here since before James Mitchell was born. I knew his grandfather, the man who founded this hospital with honor and integrity. He'd be ashamed of what his grandson just did, but I think he'd be proud of you." Rebecca squeezed back, then let the medical team surround her with monitors and IVs and expertise, trusting them to save her baby while her legal team saved her future. James had abandoned her at the hospital, but the hospital, her hospital, was embracing her, protecting her, and preparing to help her deliver not just a baby, but also the justice that had been 3 years in the making. James Mitchell's phone buzzed in his pocket while Elena was showing him paint samples for the condo they were planning to buy with the $180,000 he drained from his joint account with Rebecca over the past 6 months. They were at Rosewoods, an upscale restaurant 2 blocks from the hospital, celebrating what James called his Liberation Day with champagne that cost more than Rebecca's entire monthly grocery budget, or so he believed. Elena was laughing, her hand resting on his thigh under the table, talking about honeymoon destinations and the life they'd build together, now that he was finally free from that anchor. "You should check that," Elena said, gesturing to his phone. "Might be the hospital." James glanced at the screen and saw an email from Human Resources with the subject line, "Urgent, immediate termination and facility ban." His stomach dropped, but he told himself it had to be a mistake. Maybe a phishing scam, because he was one of the hospital's top cardiac surgeons with an impeccable record and patient satisfaction scores that administration frequently cited in board meetings. But when he opened it, the words seemed to rearrange themselves into a nightmare. "Effective immediately, your employment at St. Anthony's Memorial Hospital is terminated for cause. Security has been notified. Your access credentials have been deactivated. You are hereby banned from hospital property pending investigation into professional misconduct, patient abandonment, and creation of a hostile work environment. This action is authorized by the hospital's new owner, Montgomery Holdings, LLC. All appeals should be directed to the legal department. Your final paycheck, minus deductions for pending investigations, will be mailed within 30 days. "What the hell?" James muttered, his champagne suddenly tasting like acid. He scrolled frantically through his emails and found 6 more. One from the state medical board about an ethics complaint, one from his bank about suspicious activity and an account freeze, one from a law firm he'd never heard of about fraud charges, one from the district attorney's office, one from family court about an emergency custody hearing, and one from his mother with the subject line, "Did you know?" Elena leaned over to read his screen, but James was already opening Patricia's email. His hands shaking so badly he almost dropped the phone. Patricia's message was uncharacteristically frantic. "James, call me now. That woman Rebecca isn't who we thought. I just got a call from the hospital. They're investigating me for embezzlement from the Mitchell Family Foundation. They're saying I've been stealing for 18 months. And your wife, your ex-wife, the hospital is saying she owns it now. They're saying she's Rebecca Montgomery. The Montgomery family, pharmaceuticals, billions of dollars. James, did you marry a billionaire and not know it? My lawyers are saying the evidence is irrefutable. She documented everything. Call me." The restaurant seemed to tilt sideways. James read the email 3 times, but the words didn't change, and the reality they described felt like falling through ice into freezing water. Rebecca? His Rebecca, who bought clearance clothes and clipped coupons and never complained when he forgot their anniversary? Rebecca, who his mother had mocked for 3 years as a gold digger despite never actually asking him for money? That Rebecca was a Montgomery? "James, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," Elena said, but her voice sounded distant, tinny, like she was speaking from the end of a very long tunnel. He pulled up his browser and searched Rebecca Montgomery with trembling fingers. The results loaded, and his phone screen filled with images. Rebecca at charity galas in designer gowns. Rebecca cutting ribbons at hospital openings. Rebecca shaking hands with senators and tech CEOs. Rebecca on the cover of Forbes magazine 3 years ago with the headline, "The Quiet Billionaire, How Rebecca Montgomery Turned Inheritance into Empire." The Forbes article was dated 6 months before he'd met her. The photograph showed her in an elegant black dress, her hair styled differently, her smile more reserved, but it was unmistakably her, his wife, the woman he'd just divorced. the woman whose wheelchair he'd stepped over 4 hours ago, the woman currently in premature labor with his child in the hospital, he'd thought belonged to his family, but apparently now belonged to her. James's vision blurred as he scrolled through the article. Montgomery, 28, inherited $2.1 billion at 21, but has grown her wealth to an estimated $4.7 billion through strategic investments in medical technology, commercial real estate, in emerging markets. Unlike many young billionaires, Montgomery maintains a remarkably low profile, often appearing at charity events in modest attire and declining most interview requests. Real power doesn't need to announce itself, Montgomery told Forbes in a rare interview. I learned from my grandfather that visible wealth makes you a target, while invisible wealth makes you effective. Oh my God, James whispered, and the words felt like they were being ripped from his chest. Oh my God, what have I done? Elena grabbed his phone to read the article, her face going pale as she scrolled. Wait, this can't be right. She drove a Honda Civic. She wore Target clothes. She never... Elena stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening. James, if she's worth billions, then the money you took from the joint account was probably nothing to her, James finished numbly. She let me take it. She was watching me steal from her and documenting it. His phone buzzed again. Another email, this time from his attorney, whom he'd paid $15,000 to handle the divorce, money he'd taken from that joint account. The subject line read, "Emergency meeting required. Criminal charges filed." James opened it with hands that had performed hundreds of delicate heart surgeries, but now couldn't hold a phone steady. James, we need to meet immediately. The DA has filed charges for theft, fraud, and financial abuse. Your ex-wife's legal team has provided documentation of $180,000 in unauthorized withdrawals from a joint account that was funded entirely by her assets. They also have evidence you lied on financial disclosure forms in the divorce proceedings, claiming the account was marital property built from your income. Additionally, Rebecca Montgomery's attorneys have filed for emergency full custody of your unborn child, citing abandonment and evidence you're an unfit parent. The medical board is investigating patient abandonment after you allegedly stepped over your wife's wheelchair while she was in premature labor. James, they have video, multiple witnesses. This is bad. This is career-ending and potentially prison-level bad. We need to talk about plea bargains. The restaurant noise faded to white static. James remembered stepping over the wheelchair, remembered seeing Rebecca's face, remembered choosing Elena over his wife's medical emergency. But at the time it had felt justified. She was leaving him anyway. She was always so dramatic. She'd be fine. The hospital staff would handle it. He'd never considered that 40 people would witness it, that his own mother would film it, that it would become evidence in legal proceedings that could cost him everything. James, I think I should go, Elena said quietly, standing up and grabbing her purse. This is a lot. And if there are criminal charges, I can't be associated with... You're leaving? James looked up at her, seeing clearly, for perhaps the first time, how shallow her features were, how calculated her affection had always been. Elena, you said you loved me. You said we'd build a life together. That was when you were a respected surgeon with a 6-figure salary, Elena said, her voice cold in a way he'd never heard before. Not an unemployed criminal who's about to lose his medical license. I'm sorry, James, but I have my own career to think about. She paused, then added with devastating casualness, and honestly, if your wife is worth billions and you never knew, you're not as smart as I thought you were. Good luck with everything. She walked out of the restaurant, leaving James sitting alone with a $300 champagne bill and the wreckage of every assumption he'd ever made about his life, his wife, and his own intelligence. His phone kept buzzing. More emails, more texts, more evidence of the systematic destruction Rebecca had engineered, while he'd been too arrogant to notice he was building his own gallows. A new email appeared from an unknown sender with the subject line, "From Rebecca." James's hand shook as he opened it. James, by now you've received the legal notifications. I want you to understand something. I didn't do this out of cruelty. I did this because you abandoned a pregnant woman in medical distress, your wife, your child, and that revealed who you truly are beneath the doctor's coat and the kind words you used when we first met. You stepped over my wheelchair. Your mother filmed my suffering. Elena helped you steal from me. All of you assumed I was powerless because I chose to appear humble. You confused kindness with weakness and silence with ignorance. I gave you 3 years to prove my initial judgment of your character was wrong. Instead, you proved it was too generous. The hospital your grandfather built with integrity now belongs to someone who will restore that integrity. Your daughter will be born into a world where she knows her worth isn't determined by what she can do for narcissists. And you will learn that real consequences exist for real cruelty. I don't hate you, James. I pity you. You had everything that mattered and traded it for everything that doesn't. Goodbye. James sat in that restaurant for 3 hours after reading Rebecca's email. His champagne gone flat, his career gone entirely, his future a blank space where certainty used to live. His phone kept buzzing, but he stopped checking it because each new notification was another domino falling. His country club membership revoked, his mother's friends uninviting him from their charity boards, colleagues texting awkward messages that said, "Heard what happened, so sorry," but really meant, "Glad it's you and not me." When he finally stood to leave, his legs barely supported him, and he realized with stunning clarity that he'd spent the entire day celebrating his freedom from Rebecca while she'd been systematically ensuring he'd never be free from the consequences of how he'd treated her. He'd stepped over her wheelchair thinking he was stepping into his new life, but he'd actually stepped into the trap she'd spent 3 years carefully constructing around his arrogance. The crushing weight of what he'd lost, not the money or the career, but the woman who'd loved him enough to be patient, to give him chances, to hope he'd choose differently, finally broke through his shock, and James Mitchell stood outside Rosewood's restaurant, a place he could no longer afford, and wept for everything he'd thrown away without ever understanding its value. 6 weeks later, James Mitchell stood outside St. Anthony's Memorial Hospital, the building he could no longer enter without being arrested for trespassing, holding a letter his attorney had told him was legal suicide to deliver personally, but he'd run out of options and dignity weeks ago. His Mercedes had been repossessed, his condo was in foreclosure, and the criminal trial for fraud and theft was scheduled to begin in 2 months. Elena had blocked his number after their third date failed when he couldn't pay the bill, and his mother Patricia wasn't speaking to him because her embezzlement charges had resulted in house arrest and the complete destruction of her social standing. But none of that mattered as much as the fact that his daughter had been born 6 weeks ago. 5 weeks premature but healthy, weighing 4 pounds and 3 ounces. And he hadn't been allowed to meet her because Rebecca's emergency custody filing had been granted within 48 hours of his abandonment. The judge had watched the security footage of James stepping over Rebecca's wheelchair, had read Patricia's text messages mocking Rebecca's tears, had reviewed the financial evidence of systematic theft, and had ruled that James Mitchell posed a danger to the child's well-being and was prohibited from contact until he completed court-ordered therapy and demonstrated sustained rehabilitation. James had spent 6 weeks in a studio apartment his brother grudgingly rented to him, working as a medical consultant for $25 an hour, the only job he could get after the medical board suspended his license pending the criminal trial's outcome, and trying to understand how he'd mistaken a billionaire's humility for poverty, strategic patience for weakness, and documented evidence collection for naive acceptance of abuse. The Forbes article about Rebecca had led him down a rabbit hole of discovering who she really was. A woman who'd revolutionized pharmaceutical supply chains in developing countries, who'd anonymously funded children's hospitals across 12 states, who turned down interviews with major networks because she believed real change happens in quiet rooms, not on television. She'd been extraordinary, and he'd treated her like she was lucky to have him. The letter in his hand wasn't a legal document. His attorney had already filed all the appropriate appeals and motions, all of which had been systematically denied, but a personal one, written and rewritten 37 times over 6 weeks until James had finally managed to articulate something that wasn't excuses or justifications, but actual accountability. He didn't expect Rebecca to read it, didn't expect forgiveness, didn't even expect acknowledgement, but he needed to try because the alternative was living the rest of his life, knowing he'd been too cowardly to face what he'd done. The hospital's main entrance gleamed in the October sunlight, and James could see through the glass doors to the lobby where a new portrait hung. Rebecca Montgomery Mitchell. The plaque read, "Owner and philanthropist, dedicated to patient care, community service, and the legacy of compassionate medicine." She'd kept his last name, which somehow made everything worse. A reminder that she'd actually meant her wedding vows even when he'd abandoned his. "Can I help you?" A security guard James didn't recognize approached him, hand resting casually on his radio, in a way that communicated he knew exactly who James was and what he wasn't allowed to do. "I need to deliver this letter to Rebecca Montgomery," James said, holding up the envelope with hands that had finally stopped shaking from alcohol withdrawal 3 weeks ago. "I know I can't go inside. I'm not trying to violate the restraining order. Could you give this to her, please?" The guard studied him for a long moment, and James saw the judgment in his eyes. The knowledge of what James had done that had spread through every level of the hospital staff. But then the guard's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing desperation or perhaps just following protocol. "Wait here. I'll see if she's available." James waited for 43 minutes, standing in the designated visitor area outside the hospital property line, watching staff members come and go, some recognizing him and looking away quickly, others not knowing who he was, but sensing from his posture that he carried something heavy. The October wind picked up, and James wished he'd worn a heavier jacket, but he'd sold most of his expensive clothes to pay his attorney's retainer, and the windbreaker he wore now was from a discount store. The kind of place Rebecca had probably shopped at while married to him. Not because she couldn't afford better, but because she'd understood something about value that he never had. "Mr. Mitchell." The voice came from behind him, and James turned to find not the security guard, but Dorothy, the head nurse who'd been pushing Rebecca's wheelchair the day everything fell apart. She looked older than he remembered, or perhaps he was just seeing her clearly for the first time, noticing the lines around her eyes that spoke of 3 decades witnessing human suffering and human cruelty in equal measure. "Dorothy," James said, his voice cracking on her name, "is Rebecca, will she—" "She's upstairs with your daughter," Dorothy said, her tone neither kind nor cruel but factual. "Lily. That's what Rebecca named her. Lily Ann Mitchell. 6 pounds now, gaining weight beautifully, off oxygen for 3 weeks. She has your eyes, which Rebecca says is both a blessing and a curse." Dorothy paused, letting that land. "Rebecca read your letter. All 37 versions of it, actually. Did you know she had access to your deleted drafts? Her IT team pulled them from your email server after they took over the hospital systems." James's face burned with shame, remembering some of those earlier drafts that had been full of self-pity and blame-shifting before he'd finally stripped away the defenses and written something honest. "I didn't know that was possible." "There's a lot you didn't know," Dorothy said, but her voice had softened slightly. "Rebecca asked me to give you something." She handed him a sealed envelope that was thicker than the letter he'd sent. "She said you should read this somewhere private, and she said—" Dorothy hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She said that accountability is the first step, but it's only the first step. The court-ordered therapy, the financial restitution, the community service, those are the bare minimum. If you ever want to meet Lily, you'll need to become someone worthy of being her father, not just someone who shares her DNA." James took the envelope with trembling hands. "Is there any chance? Does Rebecca think I can—" "Rebecca thinks that people can change if they actually want to," Dorothy interrupted. "But she also knows that most people don't want to badly enough. She said to tell you that she's not interested in your redemption arc unless it's real, sustained, and not performed for an audience. She'll know if you're faking it because she spent 3 years watching you fake things." Dorothy's expression hardened slightly. That woman showed up in premature labor, got abandoned by her husband in front of 40 witnesses, and still managed to deliver a healthy baby while simultaneously destroying the people who'd abused her. "She's not someone you get to manipulate twice." "I know," James whispered. "I'm not trying to manipulate. I don't even know what I'm trying to do. Apologize? Make amends? Neither of those seems adequate." "Then read her letter," Dorothy said, turning to leave. "And Mr. Mitchell, whatever happens with you and Rebecca is between you two. But I've worked in this hospital for 30 years, and I've seen a lot of men like you. Men who thought their credentials and their charm meant they didn't have to treat people with basic decency. Some of them learned, most didn't. Figure out which kind you're going to be. She walked back into the hospital, leaving James alone with the envelope. He walked to a bench in the nearby park, the same park where he'd proposed to Rebecca 4 years ago, back when he genuinely believed he loved her, before his mother's constant criticism and Elena's flattery had eroded whatever capacity for love he'd once possessed. He sat down, opened the envelope, and began to read. James, I read all 37 drafts of your letter. The first 36 were mostly apologizing for getting caught, explaining why you did what you did, and asking me to understand your perspective. Only the 37th was actually an apology that took full responsibility without conditions or explanations. That 37th letter is why I'm responding instead of having my lawyers send a cease and desist. I need you to understand something. I didn't destroy your life. You destroyed your life by choosing cruelty over kindness, status over substance, and your mother's approval over your wife's humanity. I simply documented the choices you made and ensured those choices had consequences. The medical board suspended your license because you abandoned a patient in distress. The DA filed charges because you stole $180,000 and lied on legal documents. The family court restricted your custody because you stepped over your wife's wheelchair while she was in premature labor. I didn't make you do any of those things. I just made sure you couldn't escape accountability for doing them. You want to know why I never told you about my money? Because I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I had. I wanted a partner who'd choose me when I appeared to have nothing, because that would mean he actually saw me. Instead, I got a husband who thought he was doing me a favor by staying married to me, who let his mother mock me because defending me would have been inconvenient, who stole from me while calling me a financial burden. The cruelest part wasn't the affair, James. Affairs happen when people are cowards. The cruelest part was watching you become smaller and meaner over 3 years, watching you choose pettiness when you could have chosen growth, watching you step over my wheelchair, over your child, because acknowledging my medical emergency would have interrupted your celebration of abandoning us. But here's what I learned. You can't make someone become who you hoped they were. You can only accept who they actually are and decide whether that person deserves space in your life. You don't deserve space in my life, not the current version of you. However, Lily deserves the chance to have a father if you can become one. Not the man who stepped over wheelchairs, but someone who's done enough therapy and self-work to understand why he made those choices and how to never make them again. So here's my offer, and it's the only one you'll get. Complete the court-ordered requirements, all of them, not the bare minimum. Get therapy from someone who specializes in narcissism and emotional abuse. I've attached a list of recommended therapists. Stay sober. Yes, I know about the drinking. Get a job, any honest job, and keep it for at least a year. Make full financial restitution according to the court schedule. And most importantly, spend that time actually examining who you became and why. In 2 years, if you've done all of that and your therapist certifies you've made genuine progress, we can discuss supervised visitation with Lily. Not custody, not co-parenting. Supervised visits where you'll prove over time that you're safe for our daughter to know. If you violate any of these conditions, if you contact me outside the approved channels, if you speak to the press, if you try to manipulate public sympathy, or if you do anything that suggests you're performing rehabilitation rather than experiencing it, this offer is permanently withdrawn. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for Lily because every child deserves a chance to know their father if that father is willing to become someone worth knowing. The man I married 4 years ago had potential. The man who stepped over my wheelchair destroyed that man. I'm offering you the chance to build someone new from the rubble. Whether you actually do that work is entirely up to you. Rebecca. P.S. Your mother, Patricia, is permanently banned from any contact with Lily or me. She filmed me during a medical emergency to mock me, and that's not someone I'll ever allow near my daughter. You can maintain whatever relationship with her you choose, but she will never meet her granddaughter unless she does similar work, which I doubt she's capable of. P.P.S. Elena contacted my office asking for a settlement to keep quiet about your relationship. I had my attorney send her a cease and desist and evidence we'll use if she tries extortion. You picked quite the partner. I hope the last few months helped you understand what attracts people to you when they think you have something versus who stays when you have nothing. James read the letter 3 times, and with each reading, different sentences landed like blows. You can't make someone become who you hoped they were. The man who stepped over my wheelchair destroyed that man. I'm not doing this for you. Each sentence was precisely calibrated to cut through his defenses while offering something he didn't deserve. A path back, narrow and difficult, but a path nonetheless. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and sat on that bench for 2 more hours, watching the hospital where his daughter currently lived, where his ex-wife had rebuilt her life without him, where his grandfather's portrait still hung, but his own never would. The October sun set behind the building, and James Mitchell made a choice. Not the choice to beg for another chance, not the choice to fight the consequences, but the choice to actually do the work Rebecca outlined, regardless of whether it led back to them. He called the first therapist on Rebecca's list, scheduled an intake appointment, and began the long, humbling process of becoming someone who could look his daughter in the eyes and honestly say, I failed completely, but I'm learning to do better. Whether that would ever be enough, he didn't know. But for the first time in years, James understood that enough wasn't something he got to decide. Rebecca had given him a gift, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but accountability and a map. Everything else would be earned, slowly and painfully, in the quiet rooms where real change happens when no one's watching. He left the park as the street lights flickered on, carrying Rebecca's letter in his pocket and the crushing weight of his choices on his shoulders, finally understanding that the woman he'd stepped over had been standing the entire time. He'd just been too blind to see it. This story reveals powerful truths about relationships, power, and consequences. Rebecca's strength wasn't in her wealth, it was in her patience, documentation, and refusal to let abuse define her. James's downfall wasn't Rebecca's revenge. It was the natural outcome of his choices. Patricia's cruelty became her own prison. And Elena's opportunism left her with nothing. The lessons are clear. Never underestimate quiet people. Document abuse systematically. Real power moves in silence. Accountability is the only path to redemption. And the person you step over today might be the person who controls your tomorrow. Remember, karma isn't punishment. It's simply life ensuring that everyone eventually faces the truth of who they chose to become.